Okay, so Freud's theory of gender development. You've already covered Freud's theory. This is specifically for gender development. Okay, so Freud's or psychoanalytic or psychodynamic, any of those terms can be used. So what do we need to say? First of all, we're going to say that this occurs, according to Freud, this occurs at the phallic stage. And you'll see that different texts say different things, but we are going to say somewhere between 3 and 5 years. Sometimes you'll see it 4 to 6, but it's around about that sort of age. So that's the first point to make. Phallic stage, one of his psychosexual stages, if you want to use that term. And it is roughly about 3 to 5 years. Okay, so he's saying that children will not have a concept of gender identity before that stage kicks in. So the earliest it's going to be is 3 years old. So what do we need to say? We're going to say that actually for males we talk about the Oedipus complex, and for females we talk about the Electra complex. Okay, so these here. So you need to make sure you mention those terms. So what happens in the phallic stage? We're going to say, so these are just the words that you need to describe it. So a couple of you have asked me about AO1s, descriptive marks. This is just the knowledge, the fact, if you like, about the approach. So this is Freud's version of events. This is how he explains the way that we learn gender. Okay, so he says at the phallic stage, boys will go through Oedipus, girls will go through the Electra complex. Okay, what does that actually mean? Okay, so the next word probably is that we lust after the opposite sex parent. But specifically, he's saying it is your opposite sex parent. Okay, it's not another adult, it is the opposite sex parent. Alright, so that's a key. And because of that, you have conflict. Alright, so there's conflict between the fear of that, the parent, the other parent's response to that, and also wanting to love that parent. Okay, so for example, a boy will lust after his mother, but obviously he then fears his father, and he comes into conflict about that. He has fear of his father, he has fear of castration anxiety, thinks his father's going to take away the one thing that causes pleasure at that stage. Right, so he has castration anxiety, and because of that he will actually come into conflict, as we've already said. Now, in order to resolve that conflict, he then uses a defense, an ego defense mechanism, this one being identification, the identification process. So to resolve the conflict, he identifies with his same-sex parent, and he then internalizes all of their behaviours. But in particular for us, because we're talking about gender, it's this bit that we want to talk about. Okay, so if it's in the gender section, you're just going to talk about the gender behaviours. In other words, he basically becomes, if it's a boy, he becomes a little boy, he becomes a little father. If it's a girl, she becomes like a little mother. So in that internalization process, he takes on that parent's gender behaviours. And of course, this is all part of the unconscious determinism. It's all occurring at an unconscious level. So Freud would say you don't even know that exists. Okay. With girls, if we need to outline the Electra complex, we know that we would say, and we would always say, Oedipus boys, Electra girls. With the Electra complex, same sort of thing. Girls lust after their opposite sex parent. This causes conflict, all right, with the same-sex parent. Girls, of course, don't think they haven't got fear of castration because they think they've already been castrated. Freud couldn't quite explain this process, but he explained it away in terms of girls fearing the loss of their mother's love. Okay, so that's the only bit that's different. And then, because of this conflict, love and hate for mother, they resolve it by using identification, this ego defense mechanism. So they identify with the same-sex parent, so that with mum, internalize her gender behaviours. So that's all you need for the description, the fact. Okay, they may throw in a couple of little like testing questions about the fact that a child might be doing something before the age of 3. Obviously, the point there is that Freud would say they wouldn't have learned their gender already. Okay, but the key thing we need to know is how to evaluate that. How do we evaluate this theory? So let's have a look at that. You guys have did some preparation work on this. This is what we're going to cover now. Okay, so you've got notes on this. I'm just going to go through how we expand these points a little bit. Okay, so evaluative comments for an essay question on Freud's gender theory. Okay, you have down, first of all, Freud believes gender development occurs with Oedipal and electric complexes. We need to remember this P structure here. We've set our point. There's the point. We're going to explain it. This is where the boy decides his mother. So he's envious of father, has castration anxiety, but to resolve, he identifies with his father and internalizes gender behaviors. So obviously, if you've already put that in the top little bit, you don't need that here. But here, we could actually write an essay using the AO1 that we've already included. So just kind of ignoring that and going straight into these points, which will cover evaluation as well. So how do we evaluate that point? This is probably the most difficult point or difficult part of gender acquisition for people to accept, and made even more difficult by things like we can't operationalise, we can't measure terms like Oedipus electrophallic. Okay, this is all stuff that's in the unconscious, so how can we scientifically test it? There's simply no empirical support for the existence. So as far as we're aware, it doesn't even exist. None of this exists. Okay, there's no way we can test it. That's the first point. Secondly, Freud believes children learn gender behaviour only at the phallic stage. Roughly, we've said 3, 4, 5, something like that. Some research shows that children already have a very clear gender identity before then. Okay, so their sex type, they will play with, girls will play with little girls, boys will play with little boys before the age of 3. Okay, even by the age of 2. They're already starting to classify themselves and have a clear idea that they can label themselves as a boy or a girl. That's evidence against Freud, really. Number 3, Freud devised his theory based on the study of the case study of little Hans. You remember Hans had a phobia of white horses. Freud is explaining that in terms of it being a symbolic fear of his father. And, you know, people often say that's evidence, but that's not evidence. All it is a subjective analysis of a little boy's phobia. It doesn't use any scientific methods to test that theory. Okay, so he doesn't operationalize terms, as we've already said, empirically test them, none of that. So it's just like you coming up with some explanation, and nobody is going to test that. We don't know whether that's right or not. That's exactly what Freud's done. Number 4, Freud's theory is based on the traditional family unit. Okay, we call it sometimes the nuclear family, you might see that. In other words, his idea was that boy would lust after his mother and fear his father. So in other words, they have to have both parents. But today's society is very different. We've got many single parent families, and they seem to raise their children with very clear gender roles, very clear gender identity, despite Freud's beliefs that both parents were needed to learn gender. Okay, so that seems to be inaccurate. You guys had a little look at Cox and the research by Green, okay, on lesbian and transsexual families. Remember, Freud believed that only the traditional family unit would develop appropriate gender, but Green found that their results were quite different. So they followed 37 children aged between 3 and 20 years old in these particular families, so being raised by transsexual parents and lesbian families, and they all had a very clear gender identity, just with the possibility of one child who wasn't sure. Okay, so again, that goes against Freud's research. Okay, because they didn't have a traditional family unit, and yet they had clear gender identity. Another point, Freud's view is that very strict or harsh fathering was needed to get this very strong masculine gender identity in boys. Okay, the idea being that they needed to fear their fathers in order to have that conflict, which then leads them to identify with their father and then internalize father's gender. Okay, but that's not the case. Research shows that liberal, supportive fathers raise boys who are very clear on their gender identity, not fathers who are strict authoritarians. Oops, put too many in there. And a couple of other points. Let's go with this one. Freud believed that specifically boys had to be afraid of their fathers to learn gender. It's kind of linked to this, but the idea is that it's only with castration anxiety that they're going to identify with the father and therefore internalise. We can bring in Malinowski's research with the Trobriand Islanders. These boys were disciplined by an uncle, not their father, okay, but they still learn appropriate gender. They still learn a very clear gender identity. So how can that be? Because Freud said they have to fear their father and therefore identify with him. But here they're not having to fear their father at all. They have a very good relationship with their father. It's the uncle that disciplines them. You bring in also alternatives. Now a nice easy one is social learning theory and the biological, of course. So you've got a couple of really good evaluative points there. SLT, nice explanation, saying that we observe role models and we imitate them, and that's how we learn gender. And of course that can occur at any age. Freud, of course, so there's two differences there. First, role models have to be role models in SLT say can be any role model. Freud says it has to be your own parents, your own same-sex parent. SLT says gender development can occur at any age, really from birth. Freud says no, it happens at the phallic stage. So two clear differences. Okay. Biological, nice comparison. Biological says that there's something within us. It's due to our chromosomes, XY, XX. It's due to our hormones, testosterone, estrogen, having more of one, and that will trigger off, perhaps even alter the brain structures that we have. And from that tells us whether we're a boy or a girl. That tells us to feel that we are a boy or a girl. And they'll say that it's a biological determinism as opposed to Freud's unconscious determinism. So you've got plenty of evaluative stuff there. Okay, so that is it. That's it in a nutshell. That covers your gender identity.